One final note on the workers' rights protections and also the income benefits that exist for employees that are being affected by COVID-19. In this presentation, we really won't be able to answer specific questions about your situation because a question or an answer like that would require legal opinion. So it's important that anyone that does have questions, especially if they're urgent questions or issues, contact a lawyer or contact the Labor Commission of the state of California to get those questions answered. You don't have to take action once you know those answers, but with that information, you can better protect yourself and your future. So we will move into our section on housing protections, which we've entitled Rent and Eviction, but we'll also talk a bit about protections for homeowners in the case of late mortgage payments under COVID-19. So just a quick overview on the various eviction protections that exist now. And we're going to go through all of these in more detail. The state, starting March 16th, enacted a series of executive orders through Governor Gavin Newsom that reduced the probability that people would be evicted for non-payment of rent or evicted from their homes that they're paying mortgage for non-payment of mortgage. Those orders were enacted March 16th and March 31st. On the slide accidentally says, no, that's right, March 16th and thereafter. Those protections are very base protections that apply to everyone in the state of California, and the local jurisdictions, whether they're counties or cities, have taken additional actions to further protect their residents from finding themselves without housing during the crisis. In Coachella specifically, we took pretty bold steps to protect homeowners and renters, including in commercial and residential properties, from being evicted due to non-payment of rent. And we'll discuss in detail what those steps are. And also the Judicial Council of California, which is the body that governs the court system, adopted an emergency rule earlier in April that ordered the courts to reject any eviction filings. So those are the three major categories of protections that we'll go through now: statewide, city, and court system. And we'll take them in reverse order. So beginning with the rules applying to the court system, the Judicial Council implemented an emergency rule that applies to all courts and all eviction cases, and it remains in effect until 90 days after the governor's end of his state of emergency related to COVID-19. This rule in the courts says that a landlord may not file an eviction case. If an eviction case has already been filed, the tenant will not be under the normal responsive deadlines, or in other words, doesn't have to respond or appear in court for the eviction case until after, at least 90 days after the state of emergency is lifted. It also prohibits the court from entering any what are called default judgments, or like automatic evictions against the tenant where the tenant hasn't responded to an eviction case that was already pending. There is an exception in that rule for cases of public health and safety. So that might be where a tenant is creating safety risks or health risks to others. Those would be very severe cases, and is a very, very limited exception. So this rule created a sort of safeguard where we could feel comfortable that even landlords who accidentally or purposefully were might have filed evictions in violation of the various protections. Now we know that there's no chance they will get through the courts until this court rule is removed. So in the city of Coachella, as I mentioned, we've enacted a couple of ordinances that are rules that create strong protections, and I think the strongest in the area for tenants and homeowners that might be facing eviction for failure to pay. So in basic terms, Our protections were enacted April 8th, and so they will apply to any failures to pay rent or mortgage during April if they were enacted properly, or during May and the following months until the timelines that I will go through just now. Our protections apply to residential and commercial tenants. And the way that the protections come into play is when a tenant, whether it's a residential or commercial tenant, provides notice to the landlord within 30 days after the rent was due. So now it's May 5th. It's too late to provide notice for April, but a person who would have provided it all the way up until May 1st, essentially, would have been able to enact this protection. So it's to provide written notice to the landlord that the tenant is having a difficulty paying rent due to the crisis of COVID-19. The tenant also must provide some type of documentation to show that it's true that she's suffering the impact. And once those two steps are taken, the landlord is not allowed to file an eviction action based on the non-payment of rent. Now, that protection does not exist forever, but it is, thanks to the details of the ordinance, it is sort of extended during a safeguard period that includes and up to 6 months after the expiration of the local state of emergency. So the city of Coachella, like many other cities, have declared a state of emergency due to COVID-19. That is ongoing. It hasn't expired yet. At some point, the city will lift the declaration of emergency, as will the state and other cities. Once the declaration of emergency is lifted, the tenants who have enacted this protection will have 6 months to make up their unpaid rent before the landlord is able to take action to evict the tenant for non-payment of rent. So that's 6 months after the expiration of the declaration of emergency that the tenant can find a way to pay the back rent. Now, we know that's going to be very difficult for a lot of people, and the state and the county and the city of Coachella are looking for and already identifying some funds to help tenants bridge those shortfalls, so that the late rent payment in the future will hopefully be feasible with support from the resources provided. This is the full text, or the almost full text of our ordinance 1160 relating to residential tenants. I'll just pause for a moment for anyone that'd like to review it, because we've already gone through these details. And this is the full text of the section relating to commercial tenants. It's essentially identical as the language relating to residential tenants. So the protections that I'm mentioning that exist in Coachella really provide a great safeguard for residents of Coachella only. So it's important that anyone that's listening and may not live in Coachella or has relatives that live in other places understands that those protections do not exist in other cities. In other cities, there may be other city ordinances that provide some level of protection, or there may not. And if there are not, then everyone is protected by what are the statewide protections and orders that I'm going to go through now. Now, the statewide eviction rules are sort of considered a baseline because, as I said, they apply to all tenants in California, but also they don't actually stop eviction. What they do is delay the ability for landlords to evict tenants for non-payment of rent. So in order to enact or receive the benefit of these protections for someone who doesn't live in Coachella, the resident or the tenant who's affected must declare in writing or provide notice in writing within 7 days after the rent became due that there's an inability to pay the rent due to COVID-19. The rent payment is never relieved, which is the same as the rule under the Coachella ordinance. In other words, the rent always has to be eventually paid, but But this does prevent a landlord from filing an eviction as long as, or finalizing an eviction, I'm sorry, as long as the statewide order, the state of emergency is in effect in the state. So some recommendations for tenants who may be impacted by COVID-19 or who are seeking the protection of either the state, the city, or the Judicial Council rules. It's advised that you really have good communication, open communication with your landlord. Explain as much as possible the situation to the landlord, and even try to pay as much as the rent as you can to show good faith. And now, the law doesn't necessarily require open communication or require payment of partial rent, but these type of good faith steps and open communication with the landlord, if it's possible, is helpful to the landlords, and is also likely to produce some flexibility in terms of the landlord's willingness to keep working with you even after the emergency expires and the protections expire. It's also a good idea to save all financial documents during this period in case you need them to demonstrate to the landlord your financial impacts, or if you need them later to defend an eviction in court. And similarly, anyone who's providing notice to the landlord under any of these protections to avoid eviction should keep a copy of the notice that's being provided. And in fact, the state has produced a model letter that can just be filled out by any tenant and provided to the landlord. And the letter itself that's provided by the state says, take a picture of this letter before you turn it into the landlord. So that's an easy way to keep a copy of something, even if you don't have access to a copy machine. If a person runs into a situation, and I'm sure this will happen, where a landlord tries to evict the tenant, even though she's enacted the protections that we've discussed, that could happen in some situations just because some landlords will not know about these rules if they're small landlords, and others may do it, out of bad faith. But if that happens, we're advising people, as I said, under the workers' rights section as well, to contact a legal aid provider or a lawyer that can help you get through the process. These are new rules, and they're also temporary rules, so there is foreseen possibly a bit of challenge in the courts in terms of making sure that the judges are aware of all of these protections. And to the extent that you can find legal representation or assistance to get through the process if needed, that will be very helpful to everyone. And at the end of this section, we'll also provide a couple of resources for nonprofit or free legal aid. Okay, so moving into, this looks very similar, but we're going to talk now about the protections that exist for homeowners to prevent ejection or eviction from the homes that they're paying due to an inability to pay mortgage. So similar to the context of the landlord and tenant, the rental context, the city, the state, and the Judicial Council that operates the courts have issued a series of protections for homeowners who are still paying off their mortgage to ensure that homeowners don't find themselves ejected from their homes and under foreclosure during the period and shortly after the period of emergency due to COVID. So the protections that we've enacted in Coachella are more advanced and more protective, similar to the landlord-tenant protections. And essentially, they're providing for the same type of relief. So any homeowner that's not able to pay on their loan or on their mortgage during the COVID-19 declaration of emergency may not be ejected or may not be removed from the home due to foreclosure. The ordinance that we enacted also provides that same 6-month period after the expiration of the local emergency or the local declaration of emergency for the homeowner to make up the unpaid payments that were not paid due to COVID. It also provides for the homeowner and the lender to make an alternative period of time to repay the unpaid mortgage payments, which could be longer than 6 months if the lender's agreeing. We encourage under our ordinance that lenders offer payment plans or other payment plans, although that's not required. And all of the other rights and remedies that are available to homeowners and lenders under applicable law are not affected by this ordinance. And this ordinance, similar to Coachella's tenant protection ordinances, are in effect now until May 31st, the end of this month, but it could be and will be extended by the City Council or this city's Director of Emergency Services if we're continuing to be under the state of emergency. So it looks like this is a slide that I've somehow gotten out of order, but these are just similar recommendations as the ones I was discussing 2 slides ago or so, recommending that landlords and tenants maintain open dialogues, ensure that everything is kept in writing. And on the side of landlords, we're encouraging landlords to pursue the Small Business Administration Relief Loan Funds, which round 2 is still open. And also that landlords reach out and communicate with their lenders to seek alternatives in the case that the delayed rent payments are seriously impacting their business. Similar to tenants, we also advise that landlords seek legal counsel before initiating any eviction, because they may inadvertently or otherwise violate the state or local protections against eviction. So going back then to the context of evictions, as I mentioned, the Judicial Council that governs the courts has also implemented a rule relating to foreclosures. It's similar to the rule relating to eviction. So essentially, it prohibits the court from taking any action in any foreclosure case that's pending until 90 days after the state of emergency is canceled or ends. So that there is the exception in this rule as well for cases relating to public health and safety. And again, that would be situations where a homeowner is posing a risk to the public health and safety through, the way that he's inhabiting his home, or the way that she may be impacting neighbors through her behavior. This also postpones the legal deadlines for homeowners, similar to the way that it postponed the legal deadlines for tenants. So essentially, in a nutshell, the Judicial Council rule is stopping all foreclosure action in the courts, regardless of, whichever protections homeowners might be wanting to enact. And also regardless of any action that lenders may be wanting to take regarding homeowners. So going into the state's proposals, the state has enacted a series of protections for homeowners as well, which similar to the tenant protections, is essentially extending certain timelines. So it doesn't prohibit or end eviction of homeowners or foreclosure, but it gives longer periods than normal for homeowners to complete their payments, or for mortgage lenders to initiate foreclosure proceedings. There's a 90-day grace period mandated during which mortgage lenders are required to wait for their payments. And there's also a 60-day moratorium on beginning foreclosure sales and eviction. So that's not to say that on day 61, under the state rules, the lenders could begin those proceedings. It's just a delay essentially on the time to do so. So again, if we're talking about homeowners in the city of Coachella, we have the advanced protections to prohibit eviction or ejection up to 6 months after the end of the state of emergency to make up those unpaid mortgage payments. And if we're talking about any other jurisdiction, any other city, they may also have specific rules that are applicable. So it's important to check those. But if not, it would default to these state protections, which are essentially extending deadlines. For homeowners that are impacted by COVID-19 and unable to pay their mortgage payments, again, the recommendation is to really open communication with the lender and work to obtain with the lender sort of a new agreement or a way to make up for the payments that are going to be missed during the emergency period. In some cases, we're suggesting, in some cases, I think the state has recommended but not required, and then advocates are recommending as well that lenders take those payments that are due and unpaid during the COVID-19 emergency and tack them on to the end of the mortgage period, so that, you know, in 30 or 90 or 120 days, homeowners are not faced with 3 or 2 or 4 months worth of mortgage payments. There are many lenders who have agreed to waive late fees and other fees during the period, and soon some will be working with borrowers to find additional relief voluntarily, as I was mentioning. So again, there are innumerable lenders providing mortgage all around the state of California, so it's impossible to list them all or to identify what all of their policies or agreements have been, but we encourage all of you to get in touch with your provider to see, in addition to the protections I've already identified, what may be the best way to move forward with your lender. So the federal government also, and this is brief because I think it will be less applicable to most of our homeowners, but in the event that you're a homeowner with a government guaranteed mortgage, and those would be mortgages backed by the Federal Housing Authority, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Veterans Affairs, HUD, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Fannie Mae, or Freddie Mac, any of those loans are eligible for forbearance, which is like deferral or a pause on loan payments for up to a year with no fees, no penalties, and no additional interest. So that's an additional protection that exists only for homeowners that have home loans backed by one of these federal government programs. So going back, this is another series of recommendations for situations of mortgage non-payment or issues with payment of mortgage. Again, as I was already saying, it's very important to open communication and be in contact with the lender to learn about what programs they may have already implemented, or also to negotiate or find an agreement between the homeowner and the mortgage provider to move forward. In the event that a homeowner is having a struggle or not being able really to resolve the issues of non-payment moving forward, or foreclosure moving forward, it is possible to make a complaint about bad behavior, so to speak, on the part of the lenders through the Department of Business Oversight. And we've listed the web page here for filing a complaint, and also the phone number that a person can call. I'm just going to pause for a moment if anyone wants to take that down. All right, and locally we do have 2 service providers, nonprofits, that provide mediation and legal resources to tenants. The first is the Fair Housing Council of Riverside County. That organization exists in different offices around the county, but here locally they're located in Palm Springs. And what the Fair Housing Council will often do is do what's called mediation or sort of conflict resolution between landlords and tenants or lenders and homeowners to help the two parties reach an agreement about, the disagreement that they're having, whether it's related to unpaid rent or pending eviction actions and so forth. They're a nonprofit. Their services are free to the public. In India, we have an office of the Inland Counties Legal Services Incorporated, which is a nonprofit law firm, public interest law firm, that provides legal representation and also legal information to low-income individuals around the county. There are some restrictions on who can be helped by this organization based on income and so forth. So if you're interested in learning more about either of these services, we provided their office address, and I think both of them are closed right now. So the better way to reach them will be through the phone numbers or the internet addresses provided here. And just to close out this section, I want to reiterate, as I have already several times, anyone that is finding herself in a situation of doubt, whether it's about her ability to, not pay rent or to be evicted, or if the landlord's threatening eviction, or if there's an eviction filed, really anything, we highly recommend that you contact a legal service provider so that you can get the right legal advice related to your situation. Again, these are questions these are issues that are not enforced by the city of Coachella. We don't have the power to enforce any of those disputes or resolve any of them. Those can only be done through the legal process. And we also can't provide legal advice related to the questions that you may have.